Usually, when we look at a map of the world, we see these thick, solid lines dividing countries.
Right.
And it implies this really absolute comforting boundary. Like you cross that line, and suddenly the power dynamics, the rules, the sovereign authority, it all just changes instantly.
Yeah, exactly.
It's neat, it's color-coded, and it makes us feel like political influence has this strict geographical limit.
Which is, it's actually highly deceiving. Because real power, especially the kind we're exploring today, it doesn't stop at a border checkpoint.
Right.
It doesn't wait for a formal invitation from a local parliament. And it certainly doesn't always, plant a physical flag to let you know it's arrived.
Exactly. Real power operates a lot more like a shadow. It stretches across borders, invisible but completely undeniable, and it shapes the political and economic landscape without ever claiming formal ownership.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So today, we're stepping into that shadow. Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. We are exploring how power, money, and resistance actually operate in the Western Hemisphere.
Specifically, we're focusing on the deeply complex and often turbulent relationship between the United States and Latin America.
It's such a profound topic for a deep dive because the dynamic between the United States and its southern neighbors, it provides this historical masterclass in how modern global influence is constructed.
Right. How it's maintained and ultimately how it's challenged by the people actually living underneath it.
To guide us through this today, we are pulling from two incredible sources. First, we have an extensive article titled Oliver Stone's Salvador, 1986, Revolution for the Unacquainted by historians Dale Graydon and James Martin.
Fantastic piece.
It really is. And second, we're diving deep into the book Empire and Dissent, The United States and Latin America, edited by Fred Rosen.
Yeah, and that book is just a massive treasure trove of historical and political analysis.
It is.
It features essays from, really prominent scholars like Alan Knight, Carlos Marichal, Neil Harvey, and Sylvia Rivera-Cusiconqui.
So the mission for today's deep dive is to unpack the concept of informal empire. We want to examine how the United States has historically projected power through military proxies and financial institutions.
And conversely, how Latin American citizens and leaders have pushed back against that immense pressure.
And just as a quick heads up for you listening, because our sources cover highly politically charged historical events involving both left-wing movements and right-wing governments, we want to be clear that we are not taking sides or endorsing any political viewpoints today.
Right, absolutely not.
Our goal is simply to impartially unpack the facts, history, and analytical arguments exactly as they are presented in the source material. We're just the messengers here.
Exactly. We're basically acting as a lens to focus the insights of these authors, analyzing the specific mechanisms of power and resistance that they describe in the texts.
So let's unpack this framework. Before we can really look at how Latin America resists power today, we first have to understand how the United States built its influence in the region in the first place.
Yeah, we have to start at the foundation.
According to the historian Alan Knight in our sourcebook, the United States didn't build an empire in the traditional sense.
Right.
They didn't go around establishing formal colonies the way the Spanish or the British did. Instead, they preferred what Knight calls an informal empire.
And that distinction, it is so crucial to understanding everything that follows in this deep dive.
How so?
Well, an informal empire means the imperial power doesn't assume direct day-to-day administrative control over the host nation.
So no governors from Washington sitting in the local capitals.
Exactly. The United States isn't formally taxing the citizens of these countries. They aren't running the local police departments,
Right.
and they, aren't managing the school systems.
Yeah.
Instead, they exercise disproportionate, overwhelming power to bend the host nation to their own will without formally annexing the territory.
So the host regime technically retains its sovereignty on paper.
On paper, yes. But in practice, that sovereignty is heavily, heavily compromised.
Knight actually breaks this informal empire down into two core functions, right? The defensive function and the engineering function.
He does. And the defensive function is what most people might recognize from, say, a high school history class.
Like the Monroe Doctrine.
Precisely. It's the idea of fending off rival global powers. The United States basically drew a line in the sand and told European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere.
The goal being to preserve the geopolitical and economic benefits of the region exclusively for Washington.
Exactly. But the engineering function, that's where it gets incredibly invasive and, frankly, much more complex.
Yeah, let's get into the engineering function because that really shapes the daily lives of the people there.
So the engineering function is all about molding the host nations from the inside out to suit United States interests.
Okay.
It's about ensuring the local government, the economy, and the society are structured in a way that is entirely compliant and beneficial to the imperial power.
And because the United States prefers an informal setup, like we said, they don't do this directly.
Right. They rely heavily on finding or creating what Knight calls collaborating elites.
Collaborating elites. So these are local leaders.
Yeah, local leaders, military officers, or politicians who will do the heavy lifting of governing in a way that aligns perfectly with Washington's desires.
Which naturally leads us to what the sources call the Salvador option.
Yes, the Salvador option.
Because if you want to maintain an informal empire, you really don't want the optics or the cost of sending in massive battalions of your own American troops.
Definitely not. That ruins the whole informal illusion.
So instead, you farm out the imperial violence. You use local militaries and paramilitaries to enforce the order you want.
And to really visualize how brutal this engineering function can be, our sources point us to Oliver Stone's 1986 film, Salvador.
Yeah, and the article by Graydon and Martin dives really deep into this film.
It does. The film provides this incredibly visceral cinematic lens into the horrific realities of the 1980 to 1981 period in El Salvador.
Which was a critical turning point for the country.
Absolutely. The country was plunged into a brutal civil war between the United States-backed Salvadoran government and a coalition of 5 leftist guerrilla groups.
Right, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front.
Exactly, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. And the sources emphasize that Stone's film is just meticulous about capturing the historical facts of this conflict.
Yeah, we see this whole conflict through the eyes of a cynical, down-and-out American photojournalist named Richard Boyle, played by James Woods.
Such a gritty performance, too.
It is. And through Boyle's lens, the audience is thrown into an absolute nightmare. We aren't just hearing about dry statistics in a textbook.
No, you're seeing it on the ground.
We're seeing massive public dumping grounds for rotting corpses at El Peon.
It's terrifying.
We're seeing these deeply claustrophobic roadblocks manned by the Salvadoran National Guard. And, simply missing an internal passport or looking at an officer the wrong way means a bullet to the head right on the side of the road.
It perfectly illustrates the extreme human cost of engineering a region.
Yeah.
To keep a friendly, anti-communist government in power, the United States turned a blind eye to, and often directly funded and trained, a massive state terror apparatus.
And the film depicts the rise of right-wing figures, like the character Major Max.
Right, and the horse's note, Major Max, is very closely modeled after the real-life Roberto D'Aubuisson.
Who was Roberto D'Aubuisson, for the listener?
He was a former director of Salvadoran Army intelligence who was intimately linked to coordinating the country's notorious death squads.
What's terrifying about the depiction of Major Max in the film is the absolute certainty of his conviction.
Oh, yeah. He completely believes he's the hero.
Right. He believes he's entirely justified in slaughtering his own people to save the country. He actually orders the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero.
Which is a very real historical event.
Archbishop Romero had become increasingly radicalized, but not by, reading Marxist theory or anything like that.
No, simply by witnessing the extreme poverty, the starvation, and the grotesque land inequality among his own parishioners.
Archbishop Romero used his massive public platform to literally beg the United States government to stop sending military aid.
He pleaded with them.
He argued it was just being used to massacre the Salvadoran people. And for speaking out, he was shot through the heart by a sniper while delivering mass.
And the brutality wasn't just contained to local citizens, which is another huge point the film makes. It extended to North Americans as well.
Right, the 4 churchwomen.
Yes. The film tragically depicts the real-life abduction, rape, and execution of 4 North American churchwomen by a Salvadoran death squad in December of 1980.
Which highlights a really terrifying vulnerability in the architecture of informal empire.
Exactly. When you rely on local proxies, they sometimes operate with such extreme, uncontrollable violence that it creates massive public relations crises for the imperial power back home.
Suddenly, the American public is watching the evening news and asking why their tax dollars are funding the murder of American nuns.
It completely shatters the illusion.
Which brings up the obvious question. Why did the United States back such extreme brutality? Why tether your foreign policy to death squads?
The sources argue we have to look deeply at the Cold War context to understand that.
Go.
The Cold War essentially fused the defensive function and the engineering function into one paranoid imperative.
Paranoid is the right word.
The United States government was driven by an intense fear of Soviet and Cuban expansion in the hemisphere.
It was the era of the duck test, right?
Yes, the duck test.
As the sources describe the prevailing logic in Washington, if a reformist movement looked like a duck, swam like a duck, and quacked like a duck, meaning if local peasants advocated for basic land reform, wealth redistribution, or simply the right to form a labor union, it was automatically classified as a communist duck.
Exactly. And therefore, it was treated as a direct existential threat to United States national security, supposedly orchestrated directly by Moscow.
In Salvador, you really see this playing out in the dialogue. We see United States diplomats and military advisors completely ignoring the root causes of the rebellion.
They refuse to see what's right in front of them.
They ignore the glaring fact that a tiny elite oligarchy owned almost all the arable land while the peasantry literally starved to death.
Right. It was an agrarian crisis, fundamentally.
But instead, they manipulate intelligence to convince themselves and the American public that this is entirely a Soviet conspiracy.
They argue they need more weapons, more helicopters, more money to fight communist subversion, completely erasing the local domestic reality of the suffering.
It was a tragic, structural misdiagnosis.
And it cost tens of thousands of Salvadoran lives. The United States ended up spending billions of dollars throughout the 1980s to prop up a corrupt regime, simply because the geopolitical terror of losing a country in what they considered their backyard heavily outweighed any stated commitment to human rights or genuine democracy.
You know, listening to the setup, it doesn't sound like statecraft. It sounds like a mob boss.
A mob boss. I like that analogy.
Yeah, think about it. The boss never wants to get their own hands dirty, right? They sit in the back room of a restaurant.
Okay.
They use local enforcers, the street-level guys, to collect the protection money and keep the neighborhood terrified and in line.
Yeah, the collaborating elite.
Exactly. The boss retains total deniability. If an enforcer goes too far and whacks somebody they shouldn't have, the boss can just shrug and say, hey, I didn't order that.
Nothing to do with me.
Right. But the boss is still ultimately the one benefiting from the fear and the control of the neighborhood.
That's spot on.
But I'm struggling with something here based on what we're reading.
What's that?
If the whole point of this strategy is to remain informal and keep a clean distance, why did the situation in El Salvador become so visibly violent and hands-on?
That's a great question.
Because we had United States ambassadors deeply involved on camera, military advisors embedded on the ground, billions of dollars flowing publicly. It doesn't look very informal when you're directly pumping massive funds into a tiny country's war machine.
That is a crucial tension in the text, and Alan Knight addresses this geographical distinction perfectly.
Okay.
He points out that the Circum-Caribbean region, meaning Central America and the Caribbean islands, was always treated very differently by Washington than the larger, more distant nations of South America, like Argentina or Brazil.
Why the different treatment, though?
Mostly proximity and vital infrastructure. The Circum-Caribbean is geographically adjacent to the United States border.
Right.
Furthermore, it houses the Panama Canal, which historically was viewed almost as an extension of the United States' own territorial borders and vital trade routes.
Oh, that makes sense.
Because these Central American nations were smaller, economically poorer, and right next door, they were subjected to much more direct, heavy-handed, coercive intervention.
So the informality breaks down.
The informality only works when the population is compliant. In El Salvador, the extreme poverty and the violent consolidation of land by a tiny elite simply reached a breaking point.
The people basically decided they'd rather die fighting than continue starving quietly.
Yes. The peasants, the labor unions, radicalized sections of the Catholic Church, they organized. And when that massive grassroots resistance actually threatened to topple the compliant local elite, the United States was forced to drop the pretense of distance.
They couldn't just watch the local enforcers lose.
Exactly. They had to intervene aggressively, propping up the local military just to forcibly maintain the status quo. The informal empire is only cheap and invisible when the local population is subdued.
Right.
The moment they rebel, the empire becomes incredibly expensive, incredibly bloody, and highly visible.
So this shadow becomes a spotlight the second the local enforcers lose control of the neighborhood.
Precisely. And this leads us to a massive, fascinating evolution in imperial strategy.
Because the violence couldn't last forever.
Right. As the Cold War finally ended, and as the American public's tolerance for bloody, televised military interventions waned, partly because of the public relations disasters we just talked about,
right,
the United States didn't just pack up its imperial ambitions and go home.
No, the battlefield just shifted. The struggle for control moved from the jungle to the boardroom.
From gunboats to banknotes.
I love that. From gunboats to banknotes. This brings us to the second major theme of our deep dive, the Chile option.
Which is a concept explored extensively by Fred Rosen and Carlos Marichal in our source text.
If the Salvador option was the farming out of imperial violence to local militaries, the Chile option is the farming out of economic policy to local elites trained in free market absolutism.
Yes. To understand how this transition happened, we have to rewind slightly and look at the financial climate of the 1970s.
Okay, let's set the stage.
The sources describe this massive global lending boom. Western commercial banks were suddenly flush with massive amounts of cash, largely from oil deposits, and they were aggressively pushing huge loans onto Latin American governments.
And these governments were eager to take it.
Very eager. Many of them were brutal military dictatorships, fully supported by the United States.
Right.
Sometimes they used the money for massive infrastructure projects, but often they just used it to enrich their own generals and cronies.
But the global economic weather changed drastically in the early 1980s, right?
It did. First, global commodity prices plummeted, meaning these Latin American countries were suddenly earning far less money from the goods they exported.
So their income drops.
Exactly. And simultaneously, the United States Federal Reserve dramatically spiked international interest rates to fight domestic inflation.
Oh, wow. So their income drops and their loan payments skyrocket at the exact same time.
A perfect storm. Suddenly, the interest payments on those massive loans doubled or tripled. The debt burden became mathematically unmanageable.
And the dam finally broke in 1982.
Right.
Mexico formally announced to the world that it simply couldn't pay its foreign debt. It was totally out of money.
Which kicked off the massive Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, often called the Lost Decade.
It caused absolute panic on Wall Street.
Oh, absolute panic.
And this is where the international financial institutions, specifically the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, stepped in to play their starring role.
According to Carlos Marichal, the sudden bankruptcy of almost every Latin American government opened a prolonged period of intense, incredibly unequal negotiations.
And these weren't just standard financial negotiations over interest rates, were they?
No, they were deeply structurally political. The United States government, heavily influencing the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, used this moment of extreme crisis to enforce what became known as the Washington Consensus.
We really need to define the Washington Consensus because it's basically the engine of this new era.
We'll do it.
The International Monetary Fund essentially walked into these bankrupt nations and said, look, we'll give you the emergency rescue packages you need to avoid total economic collapse, but there are extremely strict conditions attached to this money.
Now, those conditions were a rigid, unyielding set of neoliberal economic policies.
Let's look at the actual mechanics of those conditions. The International Monetary Fund required Latin American governments to drastically cut their domestic social spending.
And this wasn't just trimming the fat.
No, this was slashing essential budgets for public health care, dismantling public education, and removing basic food and fuel subsidies that literally kept the poorest citizens alive.
Right, austere cuts.
Furthermore, they had to aggressively privatize state-owned enterprises. Water utilities, telecommunications, national airlines, they were forced to sell them all off to private, often foreign, corporate investors at bargain basement prices.
A massive fire sale.
Exactly. And finally, they had to throw open their markets to foreign trade.
Which meant completely removing tariffs and protections for local industries.
Which immediately bankrupted local farmers and manufacturers who just couldn't compete with subsidized United States imports.
Marichal points to the massive 1995 United States Treasury bailout of Mexico as the prime glaring example of this dynamic in action.
Okay, what happened in 95?
Well, in 95, Mexico faced another catastrophic currency collapse.
Yeah.
The United States government, under the Clinton administration, orchestrated a nearly $40 billion rescue package.
Wow, $40 billion.
But the texts make it clear. The primary goal of this massive bailout wasn't to save Mexican citizens from poverty or stabilize the Mexican working class.
Who is it for, then?
The mechanics of the bailout were designed primarily to save foreign investors. specifically wealthy United States investors and Wall Street firms who held high-yield Mexican government bonds, known as disbonos.
It's a staggering transfer of wealth and risk when you really look at it.
It is. The bailout money went straight into the Mexican treasury, and then almost immediately went right back out to pay off those Wall Street bondholders so they wouldn't take a loss.
So Wall Street was made whole.
Completely whole. Meanwhile, to pay back the United States Treasury for that rescue loan, the Mexican population suffered through a severe economic depression. The Mexican government implemented brutal austerity measures, hiking taxes on everyday goods and slashing public services, effectively forcing the Mexican working class to absorb the cost of a crisis created by global speculators.
It's stunning when you look at how debt evolved into the ultimate tool for imperial engineering.
It really is. Financial discipline achieved what military source often couldn't, and it did it with pristine optics.
It forced sovereign governments to legally prioritize paying foreign creditors over providing clinics, schools, or land reform for their own citizens.
And it did so without firing a single American bullet or sending a single Marine.
Right, because the collaborating elites were doing the work.
Exactly. The local elites, particularly the finance ministers of these countries who were very often educated at elite United States universities like Chicago or Harvard, they willingly implemented these policies.
They spoke the exact same economic language as the officials at the International Monetary Fund in Washington.
They became the new, highly effective, collaborative elite.
Wait, listening to this setup, it sounds exactly like a predatory payday loan.
A payday loan.
Yeah, it's like a loan shark offering you a financial lifeline to save your house from immediate foreclosure.
Okay.
But if you read the fine print of the contract, it legally requires you to sell off your living room furniture, auction off your car, and empty your kid's college fund just to keep up with the exorbitant interest payments.
Wow. Yeah.
And you sign it because the alternative is your family sleeping on the street tomorrow.
That's a bleak but very accurate comparison.
But I want to push back on the terminology here for a second. I'm struggling with the word empire or imperialism in this context.
Go on.
Nobody invaded Mexico in 1995. The Mexican government, as a sovereign entity, legally signed those loan agreements. They willingly adopted these economic reforms. How is it an empire if they signed on the dotted line?
That's exactly the defense constantly used by the architects of these policies.
Yeah.
They claim it's just rational economics mutually agreed upon.
Right.
But Carlos Marichal synthesizes this beautifully in the text. He argues that true hegemony requires massive asymmetric financial strength. Did these nations truly have a meaningful choice? When the only alternative to signing the International Monetary Fund agreement is total exclusion from the global financial system, hyperinflation, your currency becoming worthless overnight, and the total collapse of the state.
I see what you're saying.
Signing a coercive contract isn't an act of free will. It's an act of extreme desperation.
It's a choice made with a financial gun to the head.
Exactly. Marichal stresses that the entire structure of global finance is inherently political.
Right.
The United States government actively supervised these debt negotiations. They used institutions like the International Monetary Fund as leverage to ensure the global capitalist system remained secure, stable, and highly profitable for Northern investors.
And in the process, they deeply structurally eroded the national sovereignty of Latin American countries.
Absolutely. Think about it. When your national budget, which is the most basic expression of a government's priorities, is being dictated line by foreign bankers in Washington, your political independence is a fiction. You're just a manager of your own country on behalf of foreign creditors.
Exactly.
That is a chilling realization. The decisions about whether a rural village in Mexico gets a paved road or a subsidized clinic or agricultural support, they aren't being made by local voters electing representatives.
No, they're being vetoed by an invisible bondholder in New York, demanding their debt service payment.
Which logically brings us to the inevitable reaction. When the state is essentially handcuffed by debt and forced to aggressively dismantle social safety nets to pay foreign banks, everyday people are severely squeezed out.
The middle class shrinks, and the working poor are pushed to the absolute brink of survival.
So if the global financial system puts a straitjacket on the national government, where does that leave the everyday person?
You're largely abandoned by the state.
Right. If your president can't help you because his hands are tied by foreign creditors, you stop looking up for help and you start looking around. You start organizing at the absolute bottom of the economic ladder.
Yeah. How do you respond to an empire of finance when the enemy isn't a foreign soldier occupying your town square, but an invisible interest rate in another hemisphere.
To explore this, we turn to the chapters by Neil Harvey and Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui.
And these are such fascinating chapters.
They really are. They examine these vibrant, highly innovative grassroots resistance movements that emerged specifically to challenge this new neoliberal order.
Let's start with Mexico, because it's such a fascinating case study.
Let's do it.
Neil Harvey focuses on the Zapatista National Liberation Army, which emerged from the deeply impoverished indigenous communities in the southern state of Chiapas.
Yeah.
And what's so revolutionary about the Zapatistas is their completely unique strategy. Historically, throughout the 20th century, armed guerrilla movements in Latin America had one primary goal, right?
Violently overthrow the national government, seize the capital city, and take over the state apparatus.
Exactly. But the Zapatistas looked at the modern landscape and realized something profound. In an era of globalized financial power, seizing the national palace in Mexico City doesn't actually give you real power if the country's macroeconomic policy is still completely controlled by the International Monetary Fund and the Washington Consensus.
That is such a key insight. If you take over the state, you just inherit the state's debt and its subservience to the empire.
Right. So instead of a traditional military conquest aimed at the capital, they pivoted.
What do they do?
They issued what they called the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandan Forest and launched the Other campaign. Their goal was to essentially bypass the national state entirely.
Oh, wow. So just ignore the capital.
Exactly. They seek to build autonomous, horizontal, local democracy right where they live in the jungle. They create their own indigenous schools, their own independent healthcare clinics, their own cooperative agricultural systems, and their own justice systems.
And all of this is operating completely independent of the Mexican federal government.
Completely. And we see a parallel, yet culturally distinct form of grassroots resistance in Bolivia, as analyzed by Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui.
Yes, the situation in Bolivia is incredible.
She focuses intensely on the indigenous coca growers. These farmers are caught in the crosshairs of the United States war on drugs, which seeks to forcibly eradicate the coca leaf through heavily militarized interventions in the Andes, funded and directed by Washington.
Cusicanqui points out an incredible, infuriating irony in the text regarding this policy.
Oh, the Coca-Cola thing.
Yes. The Coca-Cola Company has a legal, United Nations-sanctioned monopoly exception to import massive quantities of the coca leaf for flavoring their soda.
Wait, really? A monopoly exception?
Yeah, it's a highly protected corporate right. Yet, the indigenous producers in Bolivia, who have grown, traded, and consumed the coca leaf for thousands of years for deep cultural, religious, and medicinal purposes, are suddenly criminalized.
That is wild.
Their fields are burned, and they're subjected to forced eradication campaigns directed by the United States Embassy.
It's a very stark, tangible example of how imperial engineering functions on the ground. It dictates who is legally allowed to profit from a local natural resource within the global market and who is violently punished for trying to sustain their traditional way of life with that exact same resource.
Yet the Bolivian indigenous movements didn't just accept this. They organized politically and turned the coca leaf into a profound, unifying symbol of resistance.
It wasn't just about the economics of farming a cash crop anymore. It became a fierce assertion of cultural identity.
Exactly. To understand this philosophically, our sources suggest we have to look at a major theoretical shift.
Which is?
The shift from fighting traditional imperialism to fighting what theorists Michael Hart and Antonio Negri call empire with a capital E.
I really want to unpack that because it's a dense but critical concept in the book.
Right.
What exactly is the difference between traditional imperialism and empire with a capital E?
Traditional imperialism involves a specific, identifiable nation-state extending its sovereign power over other territories.
Think of the British Empire ruling India, or even the earlier stages of the United States' informal empire in El Salvador, where the strings led directly back to Washington.
Exactly. But empire, with a capital E, refers to the modern, highly decentralized network of global financial and corporate power.
Okay.
It has no single center. It operates diffusely through multinational corporations, global financial markets, trade agreements, and international institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. It's everywhere and nowhere at once.
So because the oppressive force has evolved into a decentralized, faceless network, the resistance has also been forced to become a decentralized network.
Exactly. Hart and Negri argue that resistance is no longer a unified, traditional working-class army marching under one socialist banner led by a vanguard party.
Right.
Instead, the resistance is a diverse, sprawling multitude. It's the indigenous farmers in Chiapas building autonomous schools. It's the coca growers in Bolivia defending their crops. It's unemployed factory workers in Argentina taking over abandoned plants.
They are all fighting different localized manifestations of the exact same global empire.
Yes, in Bolivia, the simple public act of chewing the coca leaf became a powerful symbol of indigenous sovereignty and anti-imperial defiance.
It linked their ancient cultural identity directly to their modern economic survival against a global system actively trying to erase them. It's a fascinating evolution of protest. It really reminds me of how a computer virus operates.
How so?
Well, the Zapatista strategy, for example, is like a piece of code that doesn't bother trying to attack the main central processor, the national government.
Right.
It knows the central processor is heavily guarded, firewalled, and frankly already compromised by foreign software anyway.
Well, that's a good point.
Instead, the virus quietly rewrites the operating system from the outer edges of the network. It infects the local nodes, building a completely new way of operating from the ground up, ignoring the center entirely.
I like that analogy.
But I have to challenge the strategy based on the reality of global power.
Okay, challenge away.
If these grassroots movements, like the Zapatistas, refuse to try and take state power, aren't they just voluntarily resigning themselves to the margins of history? How can chewing a coca leaf or holding a local village council in the jungle actually threaten a multi-trillion-dollar global financial empire?
That is the fundamental burning debate within the Latin American left right now. But Neil Harvey and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui suggest that we have to reevaluate what threatening the empire actually means.
Okay.
The goal of these movements from below isn't necessarily to defeat the empire in a head-on conventional military or financial collision.
Because they'd lose that fight instantly.
Exactly. The goal is much deeper. It's to strip the empire of its ideological legitimacy.
How does building a local clinic or a cooperative farm strip a global financial empire of its legitimacy?
By tangibly proving that an alternative way of living actually exists. The core ideological weapon of the Washington Consensus, popularized in the 80s and 90s, is the acronym TINA. Yes. The global financial institutions claim that brutal austerity, mass privatization, and total subservience to foreign capital are simply the objective laws of nature. They claim it's the only way a modern society can function.
But then you look at these movements.
Exactly. By creating highly functional, autonomous democratic communities that do not rely on International Monetary Fund loans, that do not rely on corrupt national governments, the Zapatistas and the Bolivian coca growers shatter that ideological monopoly.
They break the spell.
Yes. They cure what the texts call the deeply ingrained depoliticization of the masses.
Which means?
The neoliberal system treats impoverished people as disposable objects, merely surplus labor for the global economy. These movements turn those everyday people into active, empowered political subjects.
They are reclaiming their human agency, organizing their own lives.
And that in itself is deeply fundamentally threatening to an empire that absolutely relies on their quiet, desperate submission to function.
That's incredibly powerful when you look at it that way.
Yeah.
They are fighting the engineering function of the empire not with automatic weapons, but with radical imagination and fierce local self-reliance.
Exactly.
But this brings up a really crucial, inevitable tension. Grassroots movements are incredibly powerful for organizing marginalized people at the local level. But what happens when the resistance actually wins the presidency?
Oh, the dynamic changes entirely.
Right. What happens when anti-imperialist political forces take control of the very state apparatus that was previously answering to foreign powers?
And that profound shift in the political landscape is where we look next. Dissent from above, when the national state changes course and tries to fight the empire.
To explore this, we turn to the chapters by Daniel Cieza, Jeffrey W. Rubin, and Steve Elner. They analyze the massive wave of political shifts, often called the pink tide, in Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela.
Yes.
These three countries represent three very distinct, complex approaches to wielding national state power against an informal empire.
Let's start with Argentina, as detailed by Daniel Cieza. Argentina provides this dramatic, tragic whiplash in national policy.
Yeah, let's talk about Carlos Menem.
Throughout the 1990s, former President Carlos Menem had what the text describes as an intimate relationship with the United States. He was the golden boy of the Washington Consensus.
He blindly followed every dictate of the International Monetary Fund.
He did. He privatized state assets with breathtaking speed, pegged the Argentine peso directly to the United States dollar to please foreign investors, and completely dismantled the nation's social safety net.
He was the absolute perfect collaborating elite for the financial empire.
He was, and Wall Street loved him for it. But that rigid adherence to International Monetary Fund policy led directly to a catastrophic economic collapse in 2001.
The country literally went bankrupt.
The banking system froze, unemployment skyrocketed, leading to massive violent street protests, the famous cacerolazos where people banged pots and pans in the streets.
And it led to a period of intense political chaos where they had 5 presidents in 2 weeks.
5 presidents in 2 weeks. Just think about that.
Wild. And out of that smoldering wreckage emerged President Nestor Kirchner.
Yes.
And Kirchner represented a massive hostile departure from the Menem era. He actively and publicly defied the International Monetary Fund.
He stood his ground.
He deliberately defaulted on massive portions of the sovereign debt and essentially forced private foreign creditors to take a massive haircut, a huge loss on their investments.
He basically called their bluff.
And then he did something even more dramatic to sever the ties. He used billions of dollars in national central bank reserves to pay off Argentina's remaining obligations to the International Monetary Fund in one lump sum.
Why would he do that?
Specifically to get their auditors out of the country so Argentina could regain its sovereign policy autonomy. He essentially fired the imperial accountants.
That is a massive assertion of national sovereignty.
It really is. Then we look at Brazil, analyzed by Jeffrey W. Rubin. Brazil took a much more cautious, pragmatic approach under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of the Workers' Party.
Lula's background is fascinating because he came from radical grassroots trade union organizing.
He represented the ultimate triumph of the multitude we talked about earlier.
Yes, but when he finally took the presidency, he faced a brutal macroeconomic dilemma.
What was it?
Brazil's economy was massive, but incredibly fragile and deeply indebted. If he radically defied the global financial system the way Kirchner did, international investors would instantly flee, the currency would collapse, and the ensuing economic depression would hurt the poorest Brazilians, his core base, the absolute most down.
So Lula had to perform this incredibly tense, high-wire balancing act.
Yes, he walked a tightrope. He tried to enact profound, sweeping social reforms, like the famous Bolsa Familia and Zero Hunger programs, which successfully lifted millions of Brazilians out of extreme poverty and addressed the country's staggering inequality.
Which is amazing.
But simultaneously, to fund those programs, he played strictly by the macroeconomic rules of the global market.
So he didn't default?
No. He religiously paid down the foreign debts, maintained high interest rates, and kept a strict budget surplus. He had to constantly assure foreign investors in New York and London that Brazil was still a safe, predictable place for their capital.
He essentially tried to use the master's tools to fix the master's house. He used the mechanisms of the financial empire to fund the welfare of the domestic multitude.
That's a great way to summarize it.
And finally, we look at Venezuela, analyzed by Steve Elner. President Hugo Chavez represents the most direct, aggressive, and confrontational anti-imperialist approach from above.
Chavez didn't just try to renegotiate the terms of the empire like Kirchner or play nicely within it like Lula.
No, he actively tried to build a completely alternative, rival geopolitical structure.
And he had a uniquely powerful weapon to do it. Massive state control over some of the largest oil reserves on the planet during a period of record-high global oil prices.
Timing is everything.
Chavez used those massive state oil revenues to bypass United States financial institutions entirely. He funded massive social missions at home, healthcare, education, subsidized food, and simultaneously created sweeping regional solidarity networks abroad.
The sources outline these really ambitious initiatives like Petroamerica, Petrocaribe, and Petrosur.
Right.
These were massive international agreements where Venezuela provided highly subsidized oil to other Latin American and Caribbean nations on incredibly favorable financing terms.
And the explicit goal was to bypass United States-dominated financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund.
He was essentially trying to use oil diplomacy to unite Latin America economically and politically, creating a regional bloc strong enough to completely reject Washington's influence.
It was a bold vision. But Steve Elner's chapter highlights a profound inherent tension in the Venezuelan model, and really in all state-led resistance.
Which is?
It's the deep tension between dissent from above and dissent from below.
Right, because when a charismatic leader like Chavez or even Kirchner consolidates immense power in the central executive branch to fight off the immense pressure of the United States empire, they naturally begin to rely on heavy top-down authority.
They become the indispensable strongman protecting the nation from foreign threats.
But that top-down centralized authority can easily suffocate and co-opt the very grassroots social movements, the independent labor unions, the indigenous councils, the neighborhood assemblies that originally propelled them into office.
Exactly. The state begins to demand absolute loyalty to the leader's political project.
Which directly contradicts the radical horizontal democracy demanded by the multitude.
It is a classic tragic dilemma of state power. Can you successfully use a rigid, hierarchical, centralized state apparatus to build a truly egalitarian, decentralized society?
You know, thinking about these three national leaders, it feels like watching three different types of rebellious teenagers living in a strict, overbearing parent's house.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Let's hear this.
Okay, so the parent, of course, is the United States informal empire and the global financial system.
Right.
Brazil, under Lula, is the teen who plays by the rules just enough to survive. He does his chores, he gets decent grades, so he can get the car keys and then quietly drive his friends to a party the parent wouldn't approve of. He works the system from the inside to get what he needs.
That's a very apt way to visualize Lula's pragmatism.
Then you have Argentina, under Kirchner. He's the teen who openly argues over the unfair allowance. He flat out refuses to do the chores, screams about the hypocrisy of the household rules, and demands to be treated as an equal adult right there in the middle of the living room, forcing a confrontation.
Spot on. And Venezuela under Chavez.
Venezuela is a teen who just moves out entirely, gets a high-paying job at the local oil refinery, and tries to start a rival, cooler family in the house next door, actively recruiting all his siblings to run away and join his new household.
That is fantastic.
But my main question for you, looking at the conclusions of these authors, are these leaders actually dismantling the architecture of the United States informal empire, or are they just successfully negotiating a slightly larger, more comfortable room inside of it?
That is the ultimate question. The authors in our source book conclude that it's a deeply complex mix, and the legacy is mixed.
Okay.
Leaders like Kirchner, Lula, and Chavez were undeniably successful in diversifying their economies. They actively found new, massive trading partners like China, which broke the United States' monopoly on their exports.
Right.
They pushed back against United States diplomatic control and asserted national sovereignty in a way that hadn't been seen in Latin America for decades. They improved the material conditions of millions of poor citizens. However, fundamentally, they're still operating within a global capitalist system. They still rely heavily on selling their raw commodities, oil, soy, minerals, on global markets dictated by the global north.
So the overarching shadow of the financial empire is still very much there, dictating the terms of global trade.
It is. And the true test of resistance, as the authors point out, isn't just whether a charismatic president can stand up to Washington and give a fiery speech at the United Nations.
What's the true test, then?
The true test is whether these state leaders can genuinely integrate and empower the radical horizontal democracy demanded by the grassroots multitude. Can the state actually empower the Zapatistas and the coca growers of the world to govern themselves? Or will the state just end up replacing foreign imperial domination with a new form of local state-led authoritarianism?
That's a heavy question.
The jury is absolutely still out on whether the state apparatus can truly serve the multitude without inevitably trying to control and pacify it.
It's a precarious, constant balance between sovereignty and submission. We've covered incredible ground today. Let's just briefly recap this journey for everyone listening.
Sure.
We started in the violent, muddy proxy battlefields of El Salvador, examining how the United States historically used raw military force and death squads to engineer a compliant region during the paranoid heights of the Cold War.
Right, the Salvador option.
We then transitioned into the quiet, suffocating coercion of the international debt crisis, seeing how strict financial discipline and international monetary fund conditionality replaced military force as the primary, invisible tool of imperial control.
The Chile option.
And finally, we explored the incredibly vibrant, diverse forms of modern resistance that sprang up in response.
Yes.
We saw Dissent from below, with indigenous farmers in the mountains creatively bypassing the state entirely to build local lived autonomy. And we saw Dissent from above, with presidents and national state houses trying to leverage their country's resources to break free from the straitjacket of the Washington Consensus.
It paints a picture of a hemisphere in constant negotiation. It's a relentless struggle between the imposition of hegemonic power and the stubborn, unyielding demand for human dignity.
Beautifully said.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought. Fred Rosen, in the introduction to our source book, suggests a really profound idea, that Latin America was essentially a trial run for modern United States global empire.
Yes, a testing ground.
It was the historical workshop where Washington tested and refined the Salvador option of proxy violence and the Chile option of systemic financial coercion before exporting those models globally.
Which naturally leads to a very provocative question for our current geopolitical moment.
Exactly. If the United States used Latin America as the brutal workshop to test out its methods of military and financial empire, what does the current innovative wave of Latin American resistance tell us about the future of global politics?
Right.
As we watch other global superpowers try to exert massive financial, technological, and military dominance around the world today, will the rest of the globe eventually adopt the Latin American playbook for resisting empire?
It's a great question to ponder.
Will we see more Zapatista-style autonomous networks quietly rewriting the operating system in other hemispheres? Or will we see more petro-diplomacy alliances popping up to challenge global financial monopolies? We'll leave that for you to explore and keep an eye on.
Because while the maps will always show those neat, solid borders,
the shadow of power and the resilient movements that fight every day to step into the light are always shifting. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.